In our headlines on this Monday afternoon, June 19th, here in South Korea. President Yoon Suk-yeol departs for France this morning to address the International Bureau of Expositions on Tuesday, as Korea's southern port city of Busan hopes to host the 2030 World Expo. Meanwhile, at a major political forum this past weekend, North Korea links its recently failed space mission to a critical defect and vows to launch a successful spy satellite into orbit in the near future. And top diplomats from the U.S. and their Chinese counterparts hold constructive talks in Beijing this past Sunday to address simmering tensions and pledge to leave communication channels open. President Yoon Suk-yeol is poised to make a high-profile pushover in Paris on Tuesday in support of Busan's bid to bring home the 2030 World Expo. Now, this will be followed by a summit with his French counterpart Emmanuel Macron before embarking on a state visit to Vietnam. Our top office correspondent Kim Do-yeon reports.
After much anticipation, the top office finally confirmed that President Yoon Suk-yeol will make his speech to the General Assembly of the Bureau International des Expositions in Paris on Tuesday in English to boost Busan's bid for 2030 World Expo. While it was already announced that Yoon would be in Paris for the BIE meeting, his office has refrained from confirming direct involvement from the president. But with Saudi Arabia's Mohammed bin Salman attending the BIE to push, the top office decided not to hold back anymore. Along with this announcement, the top office also provided more details. The 30-minute presentation is regarded as one of the last opportunities for bidders to convince BIE's 179 member states. The top office also said the presentation will, quote, fill the 30 minutes allotted to it without a dull moment, with videos and presentations telling delegates why Busan should host the expo. The president will be the final speaker following Gangnam-style singer Psy, academics as well as big-name entrepreneurs. Karina of K-pop girl group aespa and soprano Jo Soo-mi will take part virtually. Meanwhile, President Yoon wrote an op-ed in French newspaper Le Figaro last week to share his vision of Seoul-Paris ties. He expressed his commitment to joining hands with France on security issues, including North Korea and the war in Ukraine, saying that rules-based global order and peace are under threat amid intensifying conflict between liberal democracy and authoritarian forces. He said he will work with NATO members, including France, to restore peace in Ukraine, and said he looks forward to working with Paris as South Korea is set for a seat on the United Nations Security Council as a non-permanent member. He also described Busan as a port city where young French soldiers landed during the Korean War to help defend South Korea, and a place that was once filled with war refugees only to become the city with the second largest transshipment volume in the world. As for his overseas trip, President Yoon, after his BIE presentation, will meet with French President Emmanuel Macron before a state visit to Vietnam on Thursday. Kim Do-yeon, Arirang News.
Across the border in North Korea, a key political conference that this past weekend made a rare admission of failure with regard to the regime's recent space attempt and vowed to successfully place into orbit a spy satellite in the near future. Our senior foreign affairs correspondent Peun-ji has details.
On May 31st, a North Korean rocket carrying a military spy satellite crashed into the sea soon after liftoff. The failed launch was described as the most serious failure by the North at the ruling party's latest key meeting, with leader Kim Jong-un in attendance. The North state media said Monday that the officials responsible for the launch were criticized and were told to analyze the cause of the failure so that a military reconnaissance satellite can be successfully launched in the near future. But it did not elaborate on when exactly the next launch will take place. An expert told Arirang News that it's not typical for the regime to admit failure and suggested two possible reasons as to why the North may have done this. Firstly, because it's obvious that the launch failed, as South Korea has already retrieved parts of the rocket and the information might have leaked to the North Korean public. And secondly, it needs North Korean scientists to take risks in order to make the regime's space program successful.
The North Korean regime wants to make sure that its own internal scientific apparatus stays committed to constructing these things and building these things and keeps on trying and trying, right? And if the North Koreans' attitude towards failure is that scientists get, purged or they lose their privileges or whatever if these launches fail, right, then that means you can never admit failure, which means the scientists won't take the necessary chances and risks and stuff like that.
He also added that this is what makes the current Kim Jong-un regime different from the previous regime.
Kim Jong-un is a little bit more aware that these things aren't always going to go smoothly, and he's willing to admit that. And that should help, in the long term, that should help the program be more successful.
배은지, 아리랑 뉴스.
In Beijing, an almost 8-hour marathon interaction between U.S. and China's diplomats took place this past Sunday as part of efforts to ease tensions. While no concrete consensus was reached, the parties have reportedly agreed to continue communicating. Our Foreign Ministry correspondent Choi Min-jung has more.
U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken has met with his Chinese counterpart Qin Gang in Beijing on a widely anticipated mission to lower the heightened U.S. China tensions. Both sides called Sunday's meeting candid and constructive. In a statement, the U.S. State Department said Blinken stressed the need to reduce the risk of misperception and miscalculation. The State Secretary also made clear that Washington will always work with its allies and partners to advance its vision for a world that is free, open, and upholds the international rules-based order. Meanwhile, China's state media quoted Qin as having pointed out that U.S. China relations are at their lowest point. Qin remained firm in urging the U.S. to abide by the One China principle and to commit to not supporting Taiwan's independence. Although no major breakthrough was achieved, the two sides noted the importance of facilitating people-to-people exchanges between the two countries. Blinken also invited Qin to Washington to continue their discussions. Blinken's two-day visit makes him Washington's highest-level official to visit China under the Biden administration. It also marks the first visit to China by a U.S. State Secretary in 5 years. Blinken had to delay his visit to China, which had been originally planned for February, due to controversy over an alleged Chinese spy balloon flying over U.S. airspace. Choi Min-jung, Arirang News.
Material not covered in public education will be excluded from the annual college scholastic ability test, also known as Sunung here in Korea. Now, this intention follows talks between the government and ruling party at the National Assembly on this Monday, during which officials also spoke of seeking ways to enhance the testing format to ensure an appropriate level of difficulty. In particular, Education Minister Lee Ju-ho took issue with the so-called killer questions on material not covered at schools, forcing students to seek often costly private help at cram schools. Separately, the ruling People Power Party and the Yoon administration also agreed to keep open autonomous private foreign language and global high schools, whose status was set to be stripped starting in the year 2025, in line with plans by the former Moon administration. In other news, the government here has reportedly urged the U.S. to clarify its electric vehicle regulations under the Inflation Reduction Act. According to the U.S. government, Seoul is taking issue with the definition of the phrase foreign entity of concern, which currently includes companies associated with the governments of China, Russia, and other states. The issue is that the phrase can be interpreted to include almost all Chinese companies, as no further specification has been made. Seoul has reportedly called on Washington to also take into account the global interdependency of battery supply chains. Under the U.S.'s Inflation Reduction Act, vehicles that use batteries that contain any critical minerals sourced from a foreign entity of concern will be excluded from subsidies from the year 2025. Meanwhile, Koreans are stocking up on the Japanese yen as its value tumbles to its lowest level in 8 years. The combined purchase of the yen at Korea's 4 major banks in May jumped around 5-fold on year. Yen deposits at these banks amounted to nearly 811 billion yen as of last Thursday, 40% higher than at the end of June 2022. This follows the Japanese currency's depreciation to 897.49 Korean won against 100 yen on Monday, its biggest decline since June 2015. Meanwhile, here in Seoul, city officials have issued their first heatwave advisory for this year amid the unusually hot June temperatures. And as our Moon Hae-ryun reports, many other cities are enduring the same scorching phenomenon.
Many countries around the world are sweltering under a June heat wave, and Seoul was the latest to feel the heat.
On Sunday, the city was issued with a heatwave warning as temperatures soared to nearly 33 degrees Celsius during the day. It's expected to be even hotter in Seoul on Monday. A heatwave warning is issued when the feels-like temperature of 33 degrees or higher is expected to be recorded across 2 or more days in a row. The government immediately activated its Emergency Operations Center in response to the warning and will be checking in regularly with the elderly and homeless to ensure they are safe and well over the coming days. Other cities around the world were also affected heavily by the heat. Nearly 100 people died in 2 of India's most populous states of Uttar Pradesh and Bihar, according to AP News. A further 154 people in northern India were admitted to hospital with heat-related symptoms. Most of these casualties were people aged over 60 with chronic diseases that were made worse by high temperatures, prolonged exposure, or dehydration. The average high temperature in the area peaked between 40 and 45 degrees, 5 degrees higher and 25% drier than usual as a result of the delayed monsoon season. Mexico City was also hit with its hottest ever recorded June temperature, and Florida was issued a heat advisory on Sunday with temperatures soaring to 42 degrees. The Climate Prediction Center in the United States confirmed earlier in the month that El Niño conditions were present, leading to hot and dry weather in the north and wetter periods in the south of the U.S. El Niño is a climate pattern during which sea surface temperatures are higher than average in the tropical Pacific Ocean, affecting global average temperature. It last occurred in the spring and summer of 2019, but had a fairly weak impact. The European Union's Copernicus Climate Change Service reported that while there is still uncertainty about how strong the event will be this year, El Niño conditions are certainly underway. 문혜련, Arirang News.
Back on the local front, Korea's Hwasong City has installed safety barriers at pedestrian crossings within school zones to discourage jaywalking and reduce related accidents. Our Yoon has more.
This is a crosswalk in front of an elementary school in Hwasong City. When the pedestrian light turns red, people cannot walk into the street because of a barrier that closes to stop them. When the light turns green again, the barrier is raised for the people to cross. This is a smart school zone pedestrian safety system. Artificial intelligence has been incorporated to not only operate the barriers according to the traffic lights, but the barrier also provides audio assistance. This system has been installed particularly around school zones to prevent traffic accidents caused by children jaywalking.
The children see the barrier and become more careful when crossing the street. As a parent, it's a relief.
This system has been installed at 36 crosswalks in front of elementary schools around Hwasong City. Data from 7 of these crosswalks show the number of jaywalking cases has dropped from 141 before the installment to 4 afterward, a decrease of 96%.
A 96% decrease in jaywalking means this system is efficient. We will be adding 10 more installments this year.
Hwasong City will use the feedback from the current trial operation of the AI crosswalk barrier system and make any necessary improvements before starting normal operation. It's hoped that the safety system may then be actively introduced to other local governments. Yoon, Arirang News.
Researchers here are exploring the realm of blind locomotion in robots, which they believe may facilitate disaster missions where vision may be limited or absent altogether. Our Changwon-ju explains.
A 4-legged robot wearing an eye patch walks up the stairs. This dream walker is unable to see as it has no cameras or laser imaging detection and ranging LiDAR sensors, but still it moves effortlessly. The robot can manage all different kinds of movements even though it only has inertial and joint sensors attached to it. The newly developed robot moves by imagining terrain information. Made possible because 1,000 robots practiced movement through reinforcement learning in various simulated environments. The developed technology can be also directly applied to various types of robots.
There are differences between hardware and simulation, but we train the robots in various environments.
The Dreamwalker robot operates by determining which of the previously learned environments is similar to any road surface it encounters for the first time. The reaction speed is also very fast at 1,000th of a second.
The robot can be initially confused when entering new surroundings, but it will imagine the most similar environment among everything it has learned so far, and will transfer control inputs that fit the environment it's amidst.
The research team hopes the developed robot will be utilized to perform missions in disasters such as fires, as it can walk stably without being affected by external conditions. 정은주, Arirang News.
Let's take a look at what's going on in the world now. Efforts by a number of African nations to end the war in Ukraine have been dismissed by Kyiv and Moscow. Leaders and representatives from countries including South Africa, Egypt, Senegal and Zambia failed to convince Russian President Vladimir Putin and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky to begin peace negotiations. During talks in St. Petersburg on Saturday, South African President Cyril Ramaphosa presented Putin with a 10-point peace initiative. But Putin largely dismissed the plan and accused Ukraine of being unwilling to talk. Zelensky also rebuffed the proposal, saying in a meeting the previous day that negotiations would just, quote, freeze the war. The war has heavily impacted Africa as exports of grain from Ukraine and fertilizer from Russia have been restricted, increasing global food insecurity. In Uganda, burials took place on Sunday for 42 people killed in a suspected rebel attack on Friday night on a school near the Congo border. The attackers killed 38 students, 3 civilians, and a school guard. Local officials suspect that another 6 students might have been abducted. The attack has been blamed on the Islamic State-linked Allied Democratic Forces. The attackers used guns and machetes and set fire to a dormitory, burning those inside beyond recognition. The ADF is accused of launching a number of attacks against civilians over the past few years in remote areas of the country. Most recently, it was blamed for an attack in March that killed 19 people. Turning over to the United Kingdom, where the Trooping the Colour Parade returned over the weekend, led for the very first time by King Charles III. The monarch joined 1,500 soldiers, 300 horses, and hundreds of musicians marching from Buckingham Palace to Horse Guards Parade in St. James Park. Although the parade is held every year, it was the first time in over 4 decades that a monarch has ridden on horseback in the procession. The event is a royal tradition, publicly celebrating the birthday of the British sovereign. UK monarchs typically have 2 birthdays, with the real birthday celebrated in private and the other celebrated by the public in warmer weather. King Charles III's actual birthday is in November. And finally, Brussels wrapped up its annual Pedal Boat World Championship this weekend. The event took place over 2 Sundays in the Belgian capital, officially starting on June 11th. Teams tried to complete as many laps as they could in 4 hours around a 420-meter circuit at a lake in the Bois de la Cambre Park. 22 teams took part this year, mainly from Belgium, but also with some teams from Spain, France and England. The winning team managed to complete a total of 54 laps. Competitors wore colorful costumes with themes such as Where's Waldo, Pirates and the 80s. Matthew Ashley, Arirang News.
Good afternoon. What a sweltering weekend and start to the new week. The season's first heat wave advisory was issued on Sunday in Seoul, and Yangyang in Gangwon-do province had tropical nights over the weekend as the overnight temperatures stayed above 25 degrees Celsius. While tropical nights in June started last year, and even this year's first tropical night came 10 days earlier than the previous year. And of course, strong sunshine today means no relief from the heat. UV rays will be very high and ground level ozone is rising during the day. So please try to avoid outdoor activities during the hottest parts of the day and drink plenty of water even though you don't feel thirsty. Meanwhile, eastern regions in Gyeongju, Daegu, and Gangneung, which had simmering heat over the weekend, are having welcome relief this afternoon. Well, but relief is on the way with rain that's starting tomorrow in southern regions, which will gradually spread nationwide on Wednesday. That's Korea for you, and here's a look at the international weather conditions.
And those are the headlines at this hour. We have our panel session coming up next, so do stay with us. Thank you for now.
I'm live! 저를 도와주시는 분들이
저희와 함께 해줄 수 있는 세션분들
아무리 봐도 텐션 같은데 아니라고 아무도 안 하는 거고
좋아요.
Hello, I'm Gustav Slamečka, Czech ambassador. Arirang TV is doing its best as a media diplomacy channel representing Korea by delivering current affairs information and news in a balanced voice. Everyone I meet can get news about Korea through Arirang, and we are thankful. I hope Arirang TV will continue to take the lead in delivering Korea's news to the world, and I hope it will be a channel for the world and Korea to synthesize. Resonating with the world, Arirang.
전사받게 되어요. 넷!
Contour the world, simply contour. India, the United Kingdom, New Zealand. Woo!
I'm excited. You excited?
Of course.
Yeah.
Music, start.
오지 않은가요? 처음 태어난 이별에서 사는 우리 손잡아요. 부산 항해 그리운 내 형제여. 어쩌다 마주친 그대 모습에 내 마음을 빼앗겨 버렸네. 어쩌다 마주친 그대 두 눈이 내 마음을 쏟아버렸네.
There has been much public uproar here in the nation about an appalling assault in Busan, in which a man attacked a woman on the ground floor of her apartment building with a turning kick to the back of her head. He kept battering her while she lay on the floor until she lost consciousness. He was a stranger and initially sentenced to 12 years by lower court for attempted murder. Then last week, the Busan High Court acknowledged charges of attempted sexual assault as well and sentenced him to 20 years. His identity has yet to be disclosed. So what is the current law regarding the disclosure of the identities of suspects? What are the changes being proposed by the government and ruling party? And what support mechanisms are necessary to promote healing for the victims? Welcome to Issues and Insiders. In a policy consultation meeting this past Sunday, the government and ruling People Power Party reached a broader consensus on disclosing the identities of brutal crime assailants. For more on this, I have Professor Cho Hee-kyung from Hongik University here in the studio. Professor Cho, it's been a while since we've had you here in person. Welcome back.
It's nice to be back in the studio.
Right. I also have Professor Susan Hess at the University of Southern California live on the line. Professor Hess, it's a pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you for having me.
Right, Professor Cho, we'll start here then. Let's begin with a few details, Professor, about the current law here in Korea regarding the disclosure of the identities of suspects. I understand 4 criteria have to be met and then be followed by a committee review. Am I right?
The current law regarding disclosing the identity of suspect is that in general it's prohibited, and it's only actually allowed in 2 special cases. One is where the suspect is suspected of having committed violent crime, and so there is a special law regarding the punishment of serious crimes, and that allows the disclosure of identity of a suspect as if the crime has been committed in an especially heinous way, and there is very clear evidence that the suspect is the one who committed the crime, and that it's in the public interest to make the disclosure of the identity, and the suspect is not a minor, that the person is over 19 years old, over 19 years. And there is also another case where sexual crimes have been committed, and so because crimes of sexual nature is considered by their character heinous, as long as you can prove that there is sufficient evidence to show that the suspect has committed a crime, and he or she is not a minor and it's in public interest, then you can disclose the identity of the suspect. Otherwise, it's basically prohibited.
Right. But Professor Cho, am I right in claiming that some 20 years ago, though, the identities of these suspects were shared on television and the newspaper, in the media that is? What prompted the shift away from this practice?
You are absolutely right in that, up until 20 years ago, it was just free for all. The media would actually go to the house of the suspect and grab, graduation album of their high school and simply show the pictures in newspapers and broadcasts. They would disclose home address of the suspects. But the National Human Rights Commission became very concerned about this practice and decided to issue a guideline to say that identity of suspects should not be disclosed. And back in 2010, they actually amended these two particular laws regarding sexual crimes and serious crimes to allow disclosure just in those two special circumstances.
Right, I see. And before we proceed any further, Professor Hess, let's take some time now to understand perhaps the very difficult, of course, emotions that victims of violent crimes are initially forced to face. Could you walk us through these emotions?
Sure. So each person reacts differently to trauma, and there's no right or wrong way to feel. They actually may not want to talk about the violence, or they may want to talk about it all the time. They may question their religious beliefs or be angry at God. They may want to forgive the person who was violent, or they may want the person to spend the rest of their life in prison. If they knew the person, they may miss or long for that person, which is actually called trauma bonding. They may blame themselves, and they may experience depression, suicide attempts, post-traumatic stress disorder, other stress and anxiety disorders, sleeping or eating disorders, and a range of health implications.
And keeping that in mind, Professor Hess, how should families and friends, of course, seek to support these victims? I mean, what do you advise as they hope to better help their loved ones?
Yeah, so through a trauma-informed lens, you would want to follow 6 principles. So one is safety, creating a safety plan of ways to feel safe internally since we can't control the external. So healing the mind and the body, and in this situation, help from a professional would be really supportive. Trust and transparency. So try to listen and be present while refraining from judging their feelings, even if their feelings go against your feelings. Peer support and mutual self-help. So a peer support group could be supportive as it can create safety and hope, build trust, enhance collaboration, and utilize stories of lived experiences to promote healing. Collaboration, which means using power with versus power over the person, which is another form of collective healing, so that we're not alone and feeling just in our own silo. Empowerment, voice, and choice. So you can ask the person, would you like to talk, or would you like me to just be here with you? And silence is okay. And cultural, historical, and gender considerations. Policies must respond to the diverse needs of individuals by recognizing and addressing oppression, and individuals can do the same.
Right, I see. Meanwhile, moving forward, Professor Cho, do you believe social media in recent times is perhaps making it harder to hide the identities of assailants?
Definitely. You mentioned in the introduction that this Busan roundhouse or wheel kick assailant, his identity hasn't been disclosed. Officially, that's correct. His identity hasn't been disclosed by the police, but a YouTuber who investigates like crimes and so forth, he actually, the YouTuber actually took it upon himself to disclose the identity, and not only the identity, but prior criminal record of the assailant, his height, his blood type, name, address, face, pretty much every personal information that this YouTuber could collect regarding the assailant. Now, in that particular case, the victim actually requested the police for the identity to be disclosed, and technically, I think if the request had been made, and perhaps if it had happened while the assailant was still a suspect, the police might have made a decision to disclose the identity, but because he was no longer a suspect but a defendant facing a trial, the law doesn't cover that, and so they couldn't disclose his identity.
I see. And keeping that in mind, the YouTuber, Professor Jo, what legal consequences is he poised to face given this breaking of the law by unilaterally sharing the identity of this man?
You know, we still have criminal defamation, and criminal defamation applies even where what he has disclosed is true. So unless the YouTuber can show that this was strictly in public interest that he made this disclosure, he could actually be criminally charged for defamation. The assailant himself could actually sue the YouTuber for disclosing his personal information for breach of his privacy and also for defamation, and could claim civil damages.
Right, I see. Professor Hess, what are the implications, perhaps, of making public the identities of suspects in terms of healing for victims?
Yeah, so not every person who's experienced violence would like to see the person who was violent plastered everywhere, especially if this was a known person, as there are often conflicting emotions, which goes back to the trauma bonding. And I believe it's important to think in terms of healing for all families, including the family of the person who was violent and the person who was violent, which is collective healing.
Professor Hess, what support mechanisms are in place, perhaps, where you are in California for victims of violent crimes?
Yeah, so we have national, state, and local organizations. So we have the National Center for Victims of Crime. We have the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence. And within Los Angeles, the Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office has a victim services department that provides crisis intervention, emergency assistance, counseling referrals, case status notification, court escort and orientation, and restitution assistance.
Would you say the support from the government is equally as strong?
Yes, 100% for the victims, yes.
Professor Jo, back here in Korea this past Sunday, the government and ruling party agreed to pave the path for the disclosure of identities of assailants of brutal crimes. What more can you tell us about this?
Certainly, the government and President himself has called upon wider disclosure of suspects of serious crimes, especially crimes against women. I believe what they propose are to essentially extend the scope of disclosure. So currently, the two laws that I mentioned earlier regarding serious crime and sexual crime, they only apply to suspects. Now, for sexual crimes, once you are convicted, so you are a convicted sex criminal, then you are registered automatically in a database. So it's a little bit like Megan's Law in the U.S., so that even after the convicted is released, their whereabouts can be known, and residents nearby can take whatever measures that they may feel necessary. But regarding other type of crimes, non-sexual crimes, that kind of database doesn't exist. So perhaps I'm just conjecturing here, but they may increase the scope to include not just suspects but defendants in a trial as well, so that this Busan kind of case where identity couldn't be disclosed because the suspect was no longer a suspect won't happen again, and perhaps also maintaining a database of serious criminals where the risk of recidivism is high. Those kind of things are what comes to mind, but they haven't really disclosed any further details yet.
Right, they're still talking about it. Professor Hess, on a personal level, where do you stand, perhaps, on the debate here in Korea regarding the disclosure of identities of suspects? Some say more should be done to fight gender-based violence instead of simply seeking to disclose the identities of the suspects. What do you say?
Yes, I tend to agree with South Korea not sharing the image of the person who committed the crime. I think it's important to think about the harm this could potentially do to both families, specifically the LGBTQIA community, if the person was not out. I believe the importance of healing for both the person who was violent and their family, and the person who experienced the violence and their family receive support. And I really believe we need to dismantle how implicit bias impacts the social, political, and legal systems around this, specifically oppression around race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, ability, age, religion, gender identity, geography, country of origin, immigration status, all really impact individuals in the states.
Professor Zhou, here, in quite a number of cases here in the country, the picture of assailants shared by the authorities, they stand in contrast with the actual appearances of these suspects. Should Korea seek to perhaps adopt the mugshot system of the U.S., do you think?
Do you know, many people don't realize that here in Korea, police also do take mugshots because they need to be able to identify the suspects. So once they're arrested and taken into custody, they do take mugshots, but they are not allowed to disclose those mugshots without the consent of the suspect. So this is why we don't see them. They are not just automatically made public like in the United States. The reason for this is because back in 1988, there was a Supreme Court decision which said that yes, the public has a right to know, but the right to know about crimes, but the right to know doesn't necessarily include the right to know about the identity of the criminal, because that's not necessarily going to, I mean, unless the suspect is at large and, he's under, the police is actually seeking him, it's not going to help to catch him or anything. So typically the suspect is in custody of the police, and disclosure of that nature they didn't believe is necessary to prevent similar crimes being committed. And so the interpretation of the Justice Ministry is that you can't disclose identity, i.e. pictures, names, etc., without the consent of the suspect. And so this is why we have, typically these pictures of suspects in caps and face masks being led away by the police, or even in female cases, this curtain being made of hair and completely hiding their face. So I think once the police the committee has actually made a decision to disclose the identity of the suspect, then they should simply use the mugshot. I mean, it seems nonsensical that they should make the decision to disclose, but then not actually disclose what the suspect looks like currently.
Right. Professor Hess, generally speaking, do you suppose harsher punishment may serve to deter rampant, heinous crimes against women?
Actually, the research consistently finds that punishment is ineffective and quite the opposite, as it demonstrates higher levels of aggression, violence, and depression. And, it really makes sense that a large number of individuals who have experienced the criminal legal system leave prison with a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder.
Right.
Yeah, and one more thing, I'm thinking too, the American tax dollars should really be going towards healing versus incarceration, as the criminal legal system in the U.S. presents a clear case study in modern slavery.
Right, I see. And Professor Zhou here in the studio, do you believe that harsher punishment, keeping in mind, of course, what Professor Hesse just said, do you believe that harsher punishment here in the country may perhaps serve to deter crimes against women? There is talk about, some critics talking about how a punishment compared to the punishment imposed by those in other countries may be a bit more lenient.
I think our criminal justice system tend to award lenient sentences. They're not cumulative, but also parallel, which means that if you commit multiple crimes, they are not added onto, the sentences are not added on, but they are simply essentially averaged out. And so certainly compared to other countries, our punishment are somewhat weak, that they may not act as enough of a deterrence to would-be criminals. But at the same time, you need to find the root of the crimes that are being committed. And it's not necessarily always that, harsher punishment is going to deter people from committing crimes. If that were the case, having death penalty should deter everyone from, committing crime, but that's not the case.
Right, a valid point right there. Professor Hess, we have some time left, which is why I'm going to ask you a little bit about your entity, the Trauma-Informed LA, I believe. What was the basis or background behind the establishment or the founding of your entity?
That's such an interesting question from what we're talking about. So I worked in the field of domestic violence for about 20 years, and what I saw was that a lot of the domestic violence shelters were very oppressive for the women who were living in them. So we actually started, it was a group of 10 people in 2014, really wanting to change systems that are incredibly oppressive in the domestic violence arena. Then we recognize that many systems are experiencing oppression, and there is systemic racism in many of these systems. And now we have like over 5,000 people who've been participating, which has been really powerful of how can we really raise up the community voice.
Right, I see. Professor Hess, do you believe there needs to be perhaps more education within the broader public to ensure better support frameworks for the victims of violent crimes?
I do. I think what would be really helpful is to ask the victims of the violent crimes what they need and where the gaps are, especially during the COVID time, especially with domestic violence shelters. There was no room. They were being placed in hotels and motels. And for example, a lot of women who are experiencing intimate partner violence have pets, and a lot of pets are not allowed in shelters. So then the women oftentimes choose to stay with the violence or to go to the streets.
Right, unfortunately, I see. Back here in Korea, Professor Cho, I was wondering, we talked about how this YouTuber sought to disclose the identity of the man in Busan who assaulted this lady. With regard to that particular case, there were reports about how the man, while in prison, chose to threaten the woman, sending her letters and talking about how he was going to get revenge once he was out.
Yes.
Are there no legal frameworks to better support the lady in question?
In terms of legal framework supporting victims of violent crimes and particularly sex crimes, we are only just now beginning to put in place some very rudimentary infrastructure. There is certainly a system to allow victims to seek compensation for the crimes that have been committed against them from the state. But it would depend on what kind of crime has been committed, and currently, because the trial is still ongoing regarding the assailant, it's only once that process is finished that the victim would be able to engage that process. And often it's actually very traumatic for the victims because they have to relive the crime and go and testify and essentially go through all that sort of traumatic experience one more time. But not all sort of healing can be done through, obviously, monetary compensation. But currently, I think we do tend to lack somewhat the support, particularly the emotional and psychological support that can be provided to victims of these kind of crimes. I mean, we saw that, in this particular case, the victim actually wanted the identity of the assailant to be disclosed, and even that was denied to her.
We talked earlier about punishment, harsher punishment leading to perhaps deterring heinous crimes, which both Professor Hess and, of course, Professor Cho yourself disagreed with. That being said, then, would education be a better option to deal with these assailants while in prison?
I mean, education is certainly one element that needs to be present as well. This disclosure of identity is also another sort of way that people argue is there to deal with it by naming and shaming these people. They're kind of being made as examples of what can happen to you if you commit this kind of crime. But the cases where identity has been disclosed is so minuscule that it doesn't have that same effect. For example, in Korea, every year there's about 225,000 violent crimes that are committed. And so in the last decade, since this new system came into place, there's been about 250,000 cases of serious crimes, including sexual crimes. But only in 34 cases has the identity of suspect been disclosed. So the problem at the moment is that we don't really have a definitive, certain and clear guideline as to when and how these identity of suspects should be disclosed. And so that's not what really needs to be addressed.
Right, I see. More work needs to be done there then. Professor Hess, with regard to healing, what do you propose perhaps? We talked about how healing is a process, a collective process needed by both the victim's family, as well, the victim of course, and his or her family, as well as the family of the assailant. Could you tell us more about the support available for the families of assailants then?
It's interesting. That is very limited. In fact, they're sort of forgotten. Once they go to prison, they are oftentimes forgotten and they don't have a lot of resources depending on the prison that they go to. A lot don't even trust the services that are being provided in case they're being used in the trial. So they're really not getting a lot of resources that could be incredibly helpful for their healing. And we know that healing and collective healing is what is needed, not to be in a silo in a cell.
Right, like you mentioned earlier. All right, Professor Hazel, thank you so much for your time and your thoughts today. And Professor Cho here in the studio, thank you very much for your insights.
Thank you.
Right, well, that ends our Monday edition of Issues and Insiders. Thank you for watching. See you same time tomorrow. That would be Tuesday.
We are trendy. We are tradition. We are Busan. We are future. We are nature. We are Busan. We are energetic. We are eco-friendly. We are Busan. The city ready for World Expo. We are Busan. Busan is ready for World Expo.
Arirang TV is conducting a quality and satisfaction evaluation to enhance the broadcast service for viewers worldwide. Please visit our website www.arirang.com to provide your honest opinions. Participants will be entered into a draw for a chance to win prizes. 2023 Overseas TV Viewer Survey. We look forward to hearing from you.
Hello, I'm Yoon Müller, Ambassador of Slovenia to the Republic of Korea. Right now, I see Korea shining in the world. Korea has many strengths and the global presence is already here. Slovenia will continue to establish the presence in the international scene. This is also one of the reasons why we opened the embassy in Korea last year. I always thank Arirang TV for playing a big role in promoting Korean information to the world so that many people can access Korean content and get to know all aspects of Korean culture. I hope that people around the world will continue to communicate and sympathize with Korea. Resonating the world, Arirang.